Hello.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Rights Show. And today we're happy to have with us Dr. Kristof Dhont. Kristof is a senior lecturer and director of graduate studies in the School of Psychology at the University of Kent. And he's also the founder and director of SAR Club, which is dedicated to the study of human intergroup and human-animal relations. One of the topics that Kristof's work focuses on is the factors that shape people's perception about other animals, the complexities and the paradoxes of human-animal relations, and the moral psychology of animal exploitation. And today, he's going to help us to explore this topic. So we are waiting for your questions and comments in the chat. It's an intriguing topic. But first, let's say hello. Tom?
Yes. Hello to everyone who's joined. Hello to VegMet Codbod. Hello to Terry. Good evening, Terry. Hi, Victoria. Hello to Amber. Bernie. Hello, Bernie. Bernie Brannock. Hello, Linda. Hi, Bernie V. Hi, Deb. Good morning to you over in Arizona. And greetings to Dave. Oh, scrolling down. Where are we going? Hi, Rama. Hi, Corey. Johanna, Ronnie, good to see Ronnie Lee, Marion, Elliot, and Jeremy and Karen, and everyone else who's joined.
So,
we haven't got Ronnie again, have we? Oh, no.
no.
Ron the con.
So I have a question to start with, a basic one, I think. Social psychology has a long history in examining the relationship between the personal and the political. And from what I understand, one of the things it does is exploring differences between people at a personality level and see how these difficulties relate to the way we view the world, the way we engage with the political, with those who consider to be the other. And your research focuses on how these threats influence the way we see other animals. So my first question is, how stable are these threats? Are they stable enough in order to function as predictors?
Yeah, what we know from, first of all, thank you. And hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me on this great show. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here. And yes, so my topic is in social and personality psychology and how that links to political ideology and all kinds of topics related to prejudice towards other social groups, including human-animal relationships as well. So, and what we've learned from decades of research in that field of political social psychology is that there are indeed stable personality traits predicting prejudices, a wide variety of prejudices. So we know that there's a core set of personality traits or that, first of all, influence ideological attitudes, and from there on, also attitudes towards a wide range of intergroup or political topics. And these traits are indeed pretty stable over time during the lifespan. And that makes it also a bit harder to change those stable traits. And these are also related to kind of broad dimensions of personality traits. We know, for instance, from a lot of research, especially from Western societies, that the ones scoring higher on conservative measures, like measures of political conservatism, are typically also a bit lower on scales of agreeableness. So the more disagreeable someone is, the more likely these people score on social conservatism and social dominance orientation. We also know that these people are typically a bit more close-minded, so they score very low on a personality scale measuring openness to new experiences. And these traits are known to be very stable over time, someone's lifespan. It's not absolute perfect, kind of people do change over the lifespan, but on average, people kind of remain kind of relatively stable within their group of people in terms of whether they score higher or lower on these personality dimensions.
Oh, well, we've got some trouble already, Kristof, so maybe you can deal with this one.
Excellent. Where's the trouble?
Yeah. So psychologists, who do they think they are? Ask him to defend himself against sociologists. So that counts as the hard ones first, I think, from Corey there. So
I don't see the question in that. So I think Corey, I think Corey needs to clarify her question first.
no, that's the first side step, I'd say. So
Yeah.
the two concepts that you use, do you want to just kind of clarify the main concepts that you use for us, just so we know what we're talking about when we talk about them?
Okay, yeah, sure. So in the past, people often focus just on one dimension of political ideology, and that's how like a lot of public discussions go. It's about being left-wing or right-wing, being progressive or conservative, being Democrat or Republican. But we know that this is actually a very kind of simplified version of the rich world of political ideology. And a lot of research has shown that we actually at least need to distinguish between two different dimensions. And one is more capturing the social conservative dimension, social cultural attitudes. And in political ideology and political psychology, we would, from a psychological perspective, we would call that dimension right-wing authoritarianism. It's that co-variation of adhering to traditional values, being very submissive towards in-group authorities, and also being very intolerant towards norm violators. So you want to have social cultural status quo and defend existing traditions, family traditions, cultural norms at any price, right? So that's kind of the one dimension of political ideology. And the other dimension, what we capture with social dominance orientation, is more into the hierarchical inequality domain, where people also vary massively in terms of the extent to which they prefer society to be hierarchically organized and prefer inequality between social groups, or on the other hand, and that's more on the left-wing side again, whether they prefer egalitarianism between social relations in society. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, actually, let me find it. Yeah, Corey came back to us because I thought she was joking at first, but I think maybe she thinks it's worth clarifying the discipline differences. So, do you want to have a little tackle of that? I mean, obviously, I often say there's no such thing as sociology, there's no such thing as psychology. It's all social psychology, but I know that's a bit crude. But I mean, what would you say in terms of where the two? I mean, I know. You know, I was going to ask you a question about a paper that you did in 2015, where you kind of talk about that. You know, the kind of, you know, the social side, but then you got the, you know, the individual stuff. So I suppose we're into that kind of difference. Do you want to clarify that at all?
Well, I kind of agree with everything in social psychology anyway, so that's fine. So I'm on board with you, Roger. But like social psychology is somewhere in the interplay between sociology and personality psychology, and like really the psychological individual level. We look at how situations can shape people's behaviors, but then we also borrow ideas from personality psychology, how different situations can shape differences between individuals. So not everyone reacts to the same situation in the same way. And then at sociological, more societal level, we look at people's socioeconomic background, for instance. We look at systemic factors influencing people's ideas and how groups of people actually navigate the social world. So, and most of, like, if not all social justice topics, you need to kind of have an idea about what happens on all these different levels of kind of study. So there's, I would always kind of argue for, even though my specialism is in political and social psychology, I would kind of always recommend people to look outside their own area to get the fuller picture. And also,
this, in terms of what you've said already, this seems to tap into that, it seems to me. Because, you know, you were saying that people are going to change over time, and so if they move to a different culture, that would be one of the factors, wouldn't it?
Yes, yeah. So, well, one of the biggest kind of ideas that people study in social psychology is also the influence of social norms, right? Like how group norms shape your own ideas and beliefs and attitudes. So that's where that kind of group level idea comes from as well. So yeah, one of the big differences there between as a discipline would be that sociology would go for the big theories that kind of explain everything, but then at the same time, it's not always very helpful to predict individual behavior or group behavior. While social psychology, at psychological level, we have like dozens of mini theories about very specific aspects of people's behavior, but never fully understand the full picture. So that's, again, where we would need to kind of collaborate more and get ideas from each other.
Would you say, bringing it to the movement level, would you say there are some personality traits and orientations then, which we're just going to find very, very difficult to deal with, and we're probably not really going to be able to make much of a headway? What do we do there? Do we kind of move on to those more conducive to what we want to do, and they will? It's a numbers game type thing. No point in kind of expending a lot of time on the more difficult personalities. Would that be right, do you think? Would that fit in with what you've learned?
Yeah, well, that's a hard one, right? Sometimes there's still a lot of work to do where among the ones on the left-wing side of the political spectrum as well. So definitely kind of focus also on them. But at the same time, if you only focus on them, you become a very exclusion movement where you forget that most people like the status quo, like their traditions, and don't want to change them. So in terms of personality traits, well, everyone can change anyway, but it's just a lot harder for the ones who are super close-minded, are very intolerant towards change in life and changing their habits. So sometimes it's also just repackaging the message in a way that also speaks to their values without compromising your own ideas or values, of course, but it's kind of trying to find a way to communicate to these people that speaks to their kind of beliefs as well.
Kristof, a question on the social dominance orientation theory. This shows a close link, if I'm understanding correctly, between the attitudes that people have towards other animals and also those towards human groups as well, because it's that hierarchical thinking, endorsing superiority over others, and obviously the dominance, as the name suggests. So if these individual speciesism and other oppressions are connected, does that mean in theory, if we or if their attitudes towards either group change, would we expect then that to affect a change towards other groups as well? So if we affected change towards human groups, would that then affect change towards other animals, or vice versa? And if there is any truth in that, how do we then account for those in the movement who seem almost ambivalent to human oppressions, and also for those in other movements who are still speciesist? I just wonder if there's any evidence or any data that you've researched on that question.
So yeah, well, some of my research has addressed that question, and we show indeed that these at psychological level, all these kind of attitudes and ideologies are kind of clustering together and are predicted by social dominance orientation. So the higher you score on that general ideological view that you think inequality is how society needs to be organized, the higher you score on sexist belief, the higher you score on racist beliefs, but also and that's a pretty strong connection. The more you believe in human supremacy over animals and nature, and so the more speciesist you are, and all these belief systems are also psychologically connected and rooted in those dominance motives. So at the same time, it doesn't explain everything. So people are very good at categorize it. And if you kind of have these people that only want to focus on one topic, they can have a kind of put up like some blindfolds for other social injustices, right? So, and sometimes they kind of, within the animal rights movement, sometimes they benefit from social injustice if they think about the white males that only want to focus on animals and exclude feminist topics or exclude broader social inequality topics from their ideological perspectives or from the movement, it's often because they want to protect their own privilege as well. That was a tongue breaker, but so it seems like they want to kind of narrowly focus on some of these topics, even though from several perspectives, from psychology, from sociology, it doesn't really make sense to disconnect all of these or break this down of different topics that have nothing to do with each other, because basically we know that they're all connected and they are rooted in basic values as well. And they are at the systemic level, they are reproduced in the same way. So there are like clear systemic factors that show these parallels to how to keep injustice from reproducing themselves. And this happens to animals now as well. And it's very hard to kind of not see the connection there.
So, in light of what we have just explained, this very prominent view in the movement that veganism and animal rights should be apolitical cannot be supported by any scientific approach. I mean, if all these are interconnected in our psychology, deep in our minds, we cannot really put them in boxes and deal with them separately.
Yeah, that's kind of my view. Like, I don't even know what apolitical means. Everything is basically political. Like, why would you be vegan but then not wanting having to have consequences on a policy level? And that makes it a political topic, right? So, and it fits more on the left-wing side of the political spectrum, because that's where these values of egalitarianism kind of expand the scope and the more consideration towards animals. From your moral consideration and care about humans. So it naturally fits within that kind of expansion of moral concern. It's the same like when you would say it's an individual choice, it's not a moral choice. It doesn't make sense about veganism. We make moral choices, so it's not a personal choice. Our actions and behaviors have consequences for the animals that are suffering. And if you translate those moral values to policy making, to legislation, it becomes a deeply political topic that you want to strive for. And so it doesn't make sense to like say, well, we need to keep it apolitical. I think it's kind of some kind of way to end the conversation, or maybe people use it strategically to kind of have people across the political spectrum be included in the movement, but in a sense, like in the essence of it, it doesn't really make that much sense to me.
I know that in the talk that we had last week, Patrice, we sort of spoke about the interconnectedness as well, for intersectionality in the show last week, and Patrice made the point that I think that there are some folks who would maybe elevate human rights above animal rights in some cases, and I think that she said that this could potentially be an issue. I don't think the point was that we should not dismiss, and we should still acknowledge that these are connected, but that maybe there's an over elevation in some cases amongst some folks in our community. Which
to elevate animal rights
above
human rights.
No, there's an elevation of human rights above animal rights.
Okay.
For some people, I don't really see that myself in terms of from what I see online, but I know it's an expressed view from some of the more some of the folks who would call try to slander everyone who's trying to work for total liberation as intersectionalists and as as problematic in that sense.
Yeah, well, I can see why you would kind of first prioritize human rights, but at the end of the day, there's so much more work to do still with animal rights as well, that you need to go a long way to have to really reach the same level as human rights. Like, we made massive progress in the last few decades, and very fast progress on a number of these human rights topics. There's still lots of work left to do, but I don't think animal rights will come very close to the status of human rights anytime soon. So I don't see why it would be kind of one or the other even. We need to, it's not a zero-sum kind of competition, right? Like it's not because we grant more rights to animals that means we will take away rights from humans anyway. So, and yeah, some people try to portray it that way, but it's kind of a false dichotomy or a false competition going on there.
Misrepresentation of what actually is going on. I see that. There is a question from Rama. That's okay. If we could just look at that. So she 6:05 p.m. I would like to ask about challenges to the construct of speciesism. The co-sisters challenge it, partly based on the work of philosopher Cora Diamond and others. What do you think about this? And then she goes on to say, clarification, speciesism as a construct upon which to base vegan and animal rights advocacy.
What was the first part of that question? That was a bit too fast for me.
Sorry about that.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, we can all chip in this. It's a general question, really, but the construct of speciesism, the co-sisters challenge that. So, Corey Diamond, ecofeminism, I believe, right? So,
so what is the challenge there to speciesism? What is the philosophers make of that then?
And then there was a clarification after that, which said, what was the second part of that, Roger? As a construct upon which to base veganism and animal rights advocacy.
So did she mean anti-speciesism as a concept? I'm not totally sure what's been asked, to be honest.
I suppose they're challenging the speciesism itself as a construct. Perhaps that it's a construct that is being created. And that does it? Maybe is Rama asking, does speciesism actually exist? Is it an ideology that exists? Perhaps I don't know if that's the question, Rama. I'm not sure. Perhaps a little bit more clarification on that one.
Yeah, perhaps so. We might.
While we wait for Rama, just to maybe clarify on that a little bit, there's something from Dave at 6:18, which I think might be quite interesting to just ask about. This one. Vegan dietary is a good base layer. Get people to make that change and the rest will follow. And so, Kristof, with this, if looking at the research that you've done and your findings, what do you think about this? If we get people to change their behavior, could that actually lead to change in attitude? So I think most of us here on the panel, or maybe and even watching, might be reluctant to advocate for veganism for health, for example, because we're very we're kind of in veganism for ethical reasons. But you do hear a lot of people saying that they went plant-based for health or environmental reasons, for example, and then they're very much connected to other animals and the ethics of veganism. So could it be that by changing behavior and stopping the consumption of other animals, those individuals have less cognitive dissonance? Because I know that's something that you look at quite a lot, is the cognitive dissonance strategies that people have. So by taking away the consumption, that they don't need to then disassociate with the individuals that they're consuming, and therefore they're able to open up and make that connection with other animals. Is it possible that it can work that way?
I think it's possible that it works that way. I only don't know that many people who went vegan that way. Usually, like what we struggle now in all kinds of domains in psychology is that the link between attitudes and behavior is very weak. So even if you change people's attitudes towards animals, it doesn't mean that they automatically will change their dietary behaviors, their habits, and that's a whole other issue to address. So people have been thinking about, like, what about now changing the behavior a little bit first, and then see if they can change their attitudes. And in terms of veganism, there's no evidence at the moment. There's not a little studies that really consistently showing any kind of evidence for that. We do see that people, if they change a little bit of their behavior, like kind of meat reduction strategies, that they're more likely to keep that going. But there's no kind of studies have looked at that in terms of veganism at the moment. So it's still an open question. Now, what I do not believe is that if you kind of only focus on kind of dietary behavior change for health reasons, that it will kind of stay that way in the long term. Like this, you need to have like that kind of educational component to it. We know that if people, like, it's very likely that people would just switch back to old habits once they outside kind of this support network that would help them at veganism. And we see that people who are in it for there's a bit more evidence for the idea that the ones who are in it for the animal ethics reasons are more likely to stay in it, stay vegan, and kind of convinced of it. But at the same time, if you kind of lose your social support and you don't have kind of the same network, and you see that, for instance, the ones who are more have more family members with conservative values, and they kind of reluctant to support you in your veganism, these people are also more likely to switch back to non-vegan diet, lifestyle, if they ever got it to a lifestyle phase or not. So to be in it for the long term, it seems really important to educate people about animal ethics as well, and not stick to kind of these first reasons to get them to open up to veganism.
Danny said something similar here, that it's inevitable. I think this goes against the scant bit of research that we have so far. I tend to, I think I can try and drop it into the chat, just give me a second. I tend to always cite this this study here. And does that come up? Yeah, okay. So this is the vegan RD, and it's talking about preventing ex-vegans and the power of ethics. And so the general understanding that I have of all this is that the research is pretty lacking in this area. At the same time, it's kind of, it doesn't matter how somebody comes into the movement, but they have to then be exposed to the ethical side of it. And if they're not, they're the ones who tend to drop off. The ethical vegans, and I know that's a problematic term, I always say that whenever I use it, the ethical vegans tend to stay vegan. That's what the research suggests, because they've got an ethical reason for doing what they're doing. It's a little bit like the VIP thing, you know, first of all, find out the why, and then you'll sort out the how thing. If you're trying to do it the other way around, it could be problematic. So, Danny, I don't think it's inevitable, in fact, because we do have, I mean, we're back to Tom Reagan's revolving door. We do have a real problem in our movement, which is a lot of people drop out. And it could be as many as 80%, some people argue, right? Now, but most of those are not ethical vegans. At least that's kind of what the research is suggesting. Are you familiar with this kind of area, Kristof, at all?
I haven't looked at that one study that you just, but that's kind of along the lines that I was trying to also argue, that I don't think there's, like, personally, I don't know that many vegans who would kind of be vegan for non-animal ethics reasons in the first place. Like, there's no kind of reason, like, even the health reasons are not that strong to be 100% like vegan all the time. Environmental reasons can be easily like, you can use them to push people in the direction of veganism, but environmental reasons are not sufficient to stay like 100% vegan there. So the animal ethics reason is kind of the moral principle of committing to a vegan lifestyle and of not harming animals, and that seems to be the only one that would stick to people's ideas, and that kind of will commit you for a lifetime to veganism. And it's very hard to kind of move away from those values once you actually adopted them. Once your eyes are opening to the suffering there, you don't want to go back and be part of that suffering anymore. And that's not the same with health reasons. Like, everyone can violate unhealth, like we do it all the time. Like, even like if it's just a health habit, then you can be unhealthy from time to time.
I think that's exactly the reason why. I mean, we all know this. I bet we've all experienced this. Everybody in the chat will have experienced this. You get some people, and some of them have been high profile, who become no longer vegan type thing. And what do we all say? You were never vegan in the first place. And so that's a very uncomfortable thing to say, right? At the same time, there seems to be an element of truth. In other words, they have not adhered to the philosophy of veganism. They've, you know, so I mean, Tim Sheaf, whoever you want to talk about, those kind of characters. John Venus, I think, is another one. There's a few kind of high-profile ones, but then there's going to be a lot of other people who we don't know about, who kind of give up on it. That's what the research suggests. But the research also suggests that they're not going to be the ones who have embraced the ethics. So that's why, if people want to bring people into the vegan movement, it still seems to me that our job is then to expose them to the ethics. Otherwise, if we don't get to them, they're going to fall off the wagon, it seems to me.
How can be prejudice reduced? And if there is a way to reduce prejudice, we have to do it dealing with individual kinds of prejudice, or we can challenge hierarchies and the roots of oppression, of all oppression at the same time.
So yeah, most of the research in social psychology has looked at like how to reduce prejudice towards other ethnic groups, and one of the most successful ways to do it, well, prejudice defined as a negative attitude towards other groups, right? And partly also the behavioral component of discrimination. So that doesn't tackle systemic discrimination, but it could, if you change individuals' attitudes, they might become more supportive towards policy changes that can actually change things systemically. But that's a different discussion there. So, but on an individual level, you see that if you have more contact with people from other backgrounds, more intercultural contact, you become more open-minded, you become less socially dominant, you become more egalitarian. And that's kind of a very strong way to reduce and to be kind of open up towards other outgroups as well. Now, given that this kind of cluster of attitudes, ideological views are also very strongly predictive for speciesism, it might actually be a very good way to reduce speciesist ideas as well. Now, that's an individual view, kind of perspective or approach, and would only lead to changes in attitudes, and that's kind of you're not there yet, right? You still need to have kind of help with from a behavioral perspective, and then changing social norms and creating that social movement is super important to really create societal change there. And we are not benefit from any kind of creating harmony in society where everyone is getting along. Like we could be a lot more positive about about animals, farm animals, but still, or we could get along with meat eaters and having that happy, harmonious society within a deeply unequal societal structure, right? So the next thing is really to fight for social change as well. Now, typically, the ones who are more positive towards social change will also do more effort to participate in collective actions and in activism as well, but not necessarily. So there's a lot more work to be done also at different levels of society to challenge inequality between human intergroup relations, between human-animal relations. So changing attitudes alone, reducing prejudice is just the first step to open people's mind and to be more supportive towards social change.
It's almost as though you're saying that human beings are quite complex beings, isn't it? So we've got a couple of things. There's one from Jeremy and one from Marv. We also wanted to move on to, we were going to talk to you about analogies and also pandemics. But if we can do, and I've not really been monitoring the chat too closely, folks. So if there are some questions that you want, that let's just take them in order as I saw them, if that's okay. So this was really answering Dave there, which is, you see that last bit, that last sentence, veganism doesn't naturally lead to opposing male dominance. It's interesting. Patrice said that in her first question to Steve Best in 2013 at Luxembourg. Although she was talking about people on the left more generally, but activists of the left, she says that activists on the left have not stopped sexually assaulting their wives and girlfriends. They've just learned to say that it's a bad thing. But my position on this, having studied the pioneers of the movement, is that I think that the values of the pioneers would do this. that because they had a justice for all philosophy, I think that meant that adhering to, because they talked about the vegan mindset, I think that adhering to the philosophy of veganism means that you would become a non-violent person across the board, I think. And so when people say, well, veganism isn't the answer to everything, I understand what they mean. At the same time, it's kind of not right, because I know it's a kind of grand utopian vision, but they did have that thing that you adopt a vegan mindset and you would then be for justice everywhere. So I always push back against this type of thing, but I do understand it too. I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment about that. I've silenced all of it.
It ought to. It ought to. I would just kind of add the nuance to that veganism ought to lead to being consistently anti-oppression, but it doesn't necessarily lead to it, as we can see from many different people in the movement. That's why I'd say it ought to.
Well, it's probably because we've got a wimpy, wishy-washy version of veganism at the moment. That's probably what we're doing. Okay, so let's move on to Jeremy then. I'm curious how most sociologists view animal welfare.
Psychologists.
Sorry?
Oh, Freudian
Most
slip.
psychologists, not sociologists.
What did I say?
Sociologists.
Sociologists.
Oh, right. Okay.
You're biased.
Yeah, I know. I just anything with gist on the end. Yeah, that's it. It seems psychologists show we need a clear end goal, and talking about how our fellow animals' treatment distracts us from ending their use. Is there anything in your work that would contradict or support that, Kristof, maybe?
Well, as psychological scientists are typically staying away from normative perspectives like philosophy or some sociological scholars do. So we observe and we study people's behavior, and some psychologists have conducted research on meat reduction and how to reduce meat consumption rather than how to go vegan. And then my work then focus more on understanding what it means at the psychological level, what speciesism means. So there's not that type of kind of normative perspective how a group of psychologists would approach these topics. Just different research groups doing different things, and some are a bit more focused on the welfarist approaches, and others are a bit more focused on understanding veganism and how to make veganism more attractive to a broader group of people. So
what about the thing about the end goal? That if you make the end goal clear, psychologically, is that better than kind of, if you like, tactically hiding that? I think that's what Jeremy is probably getting at.
I don't think there's a lot of research on that has already kind of focused on that. The problem in psychological studies is also that we often focus on very short-term effects anyway. So, and if you can already change some behaviors or attitudes just after any experimental manipulation, we're already happy. And then what is clearly missing in the literature is the long-term intervention studies that would focus on what keeps people like continuously changing the behavior, like how can you actually change someone's behavioral habits in the long term. And that takes a lot of time, of course, and that takes a lot of research money, and that's what it's not always available for them. So, but we need to know how, first of all, how can we kind of get people's interest into veganism and into animal rights, and then if we gather that interest, it might takes a lot more to get them committed to the long-term perspective, and that's where long-term goals would probably come in as well. So I think for the short-term effects, there are numerous different entrances into getting people's interest in veganism, and different people are interested in different things. So you might actually cater in different ways to these different people and communicate in different ways. But then once you get their interest and you get their attention and they change already and they show this openness, it's probably time to also focus on the long-term goals. And
it's complicated, isn't it?
Go ahead, Wendy.
Sorry, Nella. Are you sure? I was just going to say, Kristof, it's complicated because even within the main focal points that I've been really interested in your research, which is the social dominance orientation and then the right-wing authoritarianism, even those two elements are quite contrasting, aren't they, in the way that people, the obstacles or barriers that we might have with people, in that the social dominance orientation is more an ideological preference for the group-based dominance and inequality, whereas the I can't even speak tonight, the right-wing authoritarianism reflects the endorsement of more conventional values, traditions, and kind of submissions to authority, and also a hostility towards norm violations or norm violators as well. So it seems even when we come across someone in the street, if they have either of those two things, even those two approaches are going to be quite different, aren't they? Whether someone is more hierarchical thinking or more kind of normative, one is more protecting and they're sort of maintaining order and safety, and the other is more kind of endorsing the right to be able to use other animals and be superior to other human groups as well.
It's high social dominance orientation. It becomes very complicated not to challenge that hierarchical viewpoints, right? Like, because it's deeply incoherent with any anti-speciesism, anti-racism idea. So the key is really, because these people feel very entitled to use and oppress others, including animals, and for their own benefits. It's also related to high narcissism and that type of personality trait. So I think challenging social dominance would be key to change kind of everything that comes after that. Now, the way to kind of approach that is sometimes very tricky, because once you start talking about social justice, they're already on the guard and they become very defensive. With right-wing authoritarianism or social conservatism, there's a bit more scope there, because they are not necessarily driven by these dominance motives, but they just want to make sure that they can stick to traditions. And if you can introduce veganism within other kind of traditions and then just make the traditions less like free from animal cruelty, you might actually go a long way to get some of these people on board, that you're not kind of directly want to take away their Thanksgivings, the Christmas meals, but you introduce cruelty-free products there, or animal-friendly stuff there, vegan stuff into their traditions. So there's a bit more room to change there without actually having to change some of these ideological ideas behind it.
Just kind of on that right-wing authoritarianism, does that account for what some research shows to be an increasing negative attitude towards vegans because of that, because we're violating the norm and violating the normative paradigm? Does that come from that kind of attitude?
Yeah, that's what we call like veganism threat or vegetarianism threat. They see the rise of this vegan movement and animal rights movement as a threat to societal practices and societal norms. They think like that the moment the vegan shows up at the family party, it's all ruined, right? And we all have that experience, right? Like as if you are personally responsible. Even just showing up with a vegan dish at the table, people feel deeply uncomfortable because they are confronted by this different moral values, and often they do support the idea of we should not harm other animals, or we should not harm others more generally. They feel uncomfortable to being exposed, and kind of that's what we call the moral reproach effect. Even if you're not saying anything, you're not even started the discussion, or you didn't even look, you're very friendly there. They feel like threatened in their kind of practices. And then they become very defensive in that and push back. And that's typically shown much more strongly on the right side of the political spectrum, very openly on British TV as well. Piers Morgan was bashing against veganism so explicitly, and it's very kind of in a very childish, irrational way. So there's no other reason there than kind of his feelings of threat and a bit of his kind of joking around. I want to upset people for the sake of it, of course. But so that's different with social dominators. They are really feeling entitled, like you should not kind of they would feel less uncomfortable because they definitely would keep just going a bit what they do. They're driven by human supremacy beliefs, and they see a threat from veganism for different reasons. They would want to protect the economic system, the meat industry, because that's the source of money. That's a huge kind of economic business there. So they see threat in a different way there. They would not care too much about these social norms. They would care about more about the kind of dominant positions of meat eaters in society that should not be disrupted.
When we deal with people that feel entitled to use other and exploit other animals, do you think that we should appeal to reason or to emotion? I mean, obviously, a combination of both is needed because you have to do with human beings. But I can't find it hard to believe that those that really believe in hierarchies and the choice to that they have the right to oppress other would react well to rational arguments. Do you think that maybe something that provokes emotion, like images or footage, for example, would be
that's that's a difficult one because there's also not that much evidence for it, right? So that's a topic to be explored further. But they typically score lower on empathic concern as well. So even like trying to evoke empathy for other groups or animals, like non-human animals, they would still like feel less towards these other groups. So finding ways to kind of circumvent kind of rational pushback is a good approach, but not an easy one as well, because we know that they are less empathic. They are So
it does sound very, very it's very difficult and complex. I think that when you were talking about just now about the idea of of people who are so attached to the identity of traditions and having eating the body of a turkey at Christmas, even I would imagine even trying to get that conversation to like having a seitan roast, something like that would be affronting for some people, even just the bringing up of that. So it's I hear what you're saying, that's something that people can still hold on to that tradition in a different way. And
that kind of person would probably take that joke about you being a Satanist seriously, probably. we got a question from Victoria, but I was just wondering because we got the topic of pandemics, which you've done some really recent stuff on pandemics, which are really interesting, Kristof. So it'd be great to talk about that. But we also want to talk about the kind of psychology of the use of analogies, and in terms of these kind of personality types, I was just wondering about what your thoughts were psychologically about the use of analogies, and in the movement at the moment, it's the H and the S and the R analogies which are really prevalent. What's the kind of psychology about that, and also would that play out differently in these different psychological personalities as well?
Again, there's no straightforward answers to that, like that. Science hasn't investigated this, but you can come up with a number of ideas why it cannot be, like, it's not straightforward to use them, and why it can elicit a lot of pushback, where you immediately close the door and people will not take you serious anymore. So and that's kind of coming from like a very more imperative perspective, where you start comparing historical injustices towards human outgroups and immediately use the parallel with factory farming, the fur industry, and we all know that, we all see the numbers there, I see how deeply unjust that system is. But if you talk about minority group members who have these historical grievances still very much alive, it's super sensitive. So they might react completely negative towards that, because they do not see that parallel that straightforward. And that's a nice cat, Wendy. And then
it's Brian.
Yeah. So what could happen is that is that people would just not take you seriously, and then they would start focusing on the topic of on different topics towards that you downplay these historical atrocities, that you don't take those struggles very seriously, and that and in the worst case that you kind of, with your analogies, dehumanize these ethnic minority groups, where people from these ethnic minority groups or religious backgrounds are seen as just as animals, right? Like, and then they might feel animistically dehumanized. I think we lost
Nella.
We've not lost Nella. Yeah, we've been having some technical problems today. Nella, come back. I want to probe a little bit about what you just said, Kristof, and be a bit of a devil's advocate. I'm also thinking about Donald Watson's idea of ripening up. It seems to me that the movement has learned not to do the kind of Peter crass thing of Holocaust on your plate. I think they've learned that that's very crude. But there is several people who want to start to say, well, look, Holocausts have been going on, throughout history. It means different things in different definitions. And if we then start to talk and ripen people up to the idea that there is a animal Holocaust, but it's not connected to the Holocaust, is that going to fly at all? Or is that just going to run into the fact that from a kind of ethno point of view, people are going to hear the Holocaust no matter what you say?
Yeah, I think that's indeed that kind of the reaction you can expect. Like, it's not language that is being used outside and now we see all these screens swapping.
She's back.
Welcome back, Nella. So yeah, I think that the use of the word Holocaust is so triggering there that it's going to shift the focus on the Holocaust that everyone understands, and we can have that kind of intellectual debate within very narrow, like, vegan activist movements, and then see what we come up as an alternative. But I don't think it's ready to take it to the streets and start talking about it, because it doesn't seem like, to me, that people would just pick that up and start using it in that same way like you intended it to use.
Also, there's something interesting.
There's no way to really kind of clarify that you're not talking about the Holocaust. You're talking about the animal Holocaust. It's because there's a lot of people who really want to do this now at the moment. And, I'm just curious about whether it's going to fly at all,
Well, it seems very complicated to me to kind of trying to use that and kind of trying to change the meaning of a word that has that historical connotation anyway, and that kind of how to change that in the mindset of the mass in society. I mean, that word is not used in any other context, and then you're kind of trying to use that language for your own cause. So you might actually, again, be seen as someone using historical atrocities for their own cause that people do not support yet. So it doesn't seem like very strategic there to kind of use that type of language.
Also, Kristof, something interesting from your research as well is that I remember you saying something like drawing similarities with other animals is not enough, because although as vegans and animal rights and animal liberationists, when we talk about things like Holocaust, for example, in our mind, we are elevating other animals out of the status that they're currently seen in. We want to elevate that status by doing that. But what other people frame it that we are devaluing the human status downward. So it's obviously these are all concepts and constructs in our own minds, but that's how other people see it. So and you said that in your research that has an important effect in the effect that people has on people's cognition and attitudes, whether you're elevating other animals or whether you're sort of devaluing the human status. Could you explain a little bit more on that, perhaps?
Yeah, so one of the things you want to try to achieve is like elevating this more status of animals, right? And then kind of closing the human-animal divide, like that gap that we see between different types of animals, especially farmed animals. And that gap is much, much smaller for companion animals. That they're actually quite high and almost at the same level as humans, especially as family members. But if you then trying to kind of close that gap in a certain way, the way you frame it seems pretty important in terms of avoiding that you say kind of put humans on the lower animal status rather than elevating the animals to the human status. So if you frame it from humans are more similar than animals than you think, people can find that very offensive as well and kind of feel that you dehumanizes them. So it seems kind of that type of communication strategies needs to be avoided, and it's more important to kind of highlight what animals have in common with humans as well. So like if they have complex social networks, complex emotions, and complex cognitive kind of capacities, that can actually elevate the status to a higher level and come closer to humans. And some of the research now show also that once humans kind of evaluate animals in terms of kind of moral consideration, things that really help well to elevate or kind of attribute moral minds to animals and more consideration to animals, and is highlighting that animals can have complex moral capacities as well, that they also moral minds in their own, that they are that they have kind of secondary emotions, what we call in psychology, that these are not just constrained to just feelings of pain, but they can also be, and not just animals cannot just be happy or sad, but they also have social emotions. They can grieve and they can care for other animals. So that seems to kind of the type of traits that people value a lot in animals, and that elevates their moral status, and also consider them like less acceptable to eat them then.
Just a little bit. Sorry, Wendy. Just a bit of timekeeping here, because Michelle Lowe was really kind enough, because Michelle was going to do something at our time, and then she agreed to start it at 7:30. So we can go over, but I think we ought to try and aim for 7:15 at the latest, perhaps 20 past, so people can have a break and then go on to that. Is that all right? Sorry to interrupt, Wendy.
No, that's okay. I think I was just about to say, in summary to what, or as a follow-up kind of question to what Kristof just said. So if we use the negative analogies like the R word, the S word, the H word, if we use all of that in using those negative comparisons and not really, would you say, are not really elevating the status, they're more doing the other, devaluing humans, whereas we need to focus more on drawing the positive parallels between other animals and humans in terms of social complexities, friendships, relationships, things like this.
Yeah, that's part of it. But with these other analogies, like these using this very negative language, it can also trigger a lot of traumas where people have first-hand experience of kind of these things. So, and that's just not what you want, right? You don't want to have these traumas coming out during your activism at all, because you're just being seen as an absolute insensitive asshole there. So you don't.
And people's barriers would just go straight up, then, don't they? They're not open to hear you anyway. So the defensive. So,
and with kind of, if you're a survivor of domestic abuse or survivor of sexual abuse, you don't want to hear these words during animal rights activism, and using that type of language can trigger very kind of a lot of anxiety and a lot of can come across as super insensitive, as from kind of that moralistic perspective that you can just adopt that to fight for your own cause, and people will not listen what your cause is. They just can only hear that. With use of the word Holocaust, it's more that kind of group trauma that is still alive today. There's still so much anti-Semitism around. So you trigger different things there, and people will focus on those topics rather than on your topic that you want to advocate for.
Since we are talking about the movement, lately, I mean, during the last year, an argument that many activists have used is the argument of the pandemic. And one would expect that ethics apart, people would be more willing to look into what the animal industrial complex means in terms of our lives and of human health and pandemics, but they didn't, and you have looked into that in a paper that was recently published. So do you want to explain a bit about that?
Yeah, so in that research, we kind of got, like a year ago, we got the impression like the public discussions is really much focused on reactionary strategies to kind of prevent the spread of the pandemic rather than tackling the causes that can of these diseases. And it was deeply disturbing to me that almost no one was talking about kind of our relationships towards other animals and our exploitative behavior towards animals that is actually by definition a reason for these diseases to occur in the first place. And then around April, May last year, people had a bit of this discussion on animal markets in China, and they were very good at highlighting that it's all happening in China, rather than looking closer to home and looking at their own practices of meat consumption and animal farming, where there's so much risk factors involved there that can cause to new infectious diseases, and it happens all the time. And it's very well documented in the top scientific journals that farm factory, but also other types of animal agriculture are huge risk factors for infectious diseases. We have the avian flu, the swine flu, all these diseases that occur all the time, and it can become a zoonotic disease and cause new pandemics. So there's kind of very like scientific awareness on this topic, yet people do not want to discuss that as much in the media or in newspapers. There was maybe one or two opinion pieces that actually focused on factory farming or on animal agriculture as a problem. So what we want to do is, first of all, like look at people's beliefs and opinions about diseases, and then you indeed see that kind of one of the problems with the pandemics is that we were not prepared enough. There were no technological infrastructure. Countries were not communicating well enough. So they look at these kind of causes that are actually there that are helping the spread of the disease, but not the causes that actually started the disease in the first place, like no animal discussion there. Then the second one that was also endorsed is kind of the unhealthy or unhygienic circumstances of wet animal markets. And that's kind of where the conversation got stuck. And then a number of environmentalists and environmental scientists argued, yeah, now we need to close wet markets, and especially in China, and that kind of gained a lot of traction and support. People were all on board of that because it's far away and it doesn't implicate their own consumption habits. So, and that's where the meat-motivated mind comes in again. Like once you kind of expose them to information, like scientifically document information, like, well, you're not that innocent. It's not just there that these problems are happening. Factory farming, animal agriculture, and immediately your meat consumption behavior that actually kind of makes it happening and kind of helps the whole industry there is directly responsible for a zoonotic disease threat as well, and for these disease risks that are there, and even basically it's even more. But we kept it very constant in two conditions, and then what we see, like if we ask them about like what do you think needs to be done now to address zoonotic disease risk from wet markets, all the respondents were very much in favor of, yes, they need to be closed down. People cannot just eat wild animals anymore. But if you ask the same questions about farmed animals and meat consumptions, they were not as supportive anymore. Like they were supporting, again, reactionary strategies, yeah, more mouth masks and kind of bans on traveling and things like that. But they would not question their own meat consumption behavior to the same extent. They would not support banning animal agriculture. The farthest that they wanted to go was kind of was having better hygiene in factory farms as well. That's kind of what they can get behind because it doesn't implicate their own meat consumption. Now, how do we know that it was directly related to kind of their dietary habits? Is that these effects were much, much stronger among those people who were very high on meat commitment. So the ones who actually say that they cannot miss their meat from any single meal, or they are highly committed to meat consumption, showed the strongest gap between preventive strategies and reactionary strategies to kind of tackle zoonotic disease risks from animal agriculture industries. So yeah, that's kind of a very it was very clear that pattern of findings that we based our ideas and rationality from the literature on the meat motivated mind, that people go at great lengths to defend their meat consumption habits. And we believe that it's the same for other animal products. Like they would also defend their cheese habits. That's what you typically see among vegetarians. But cheese, we cannot give up cheese. You see this kind of the same dynamic with cannot give up meat. And people are super flexible to avoid these kind of moral problems, the dissonance that they feel between, we do not support harming animals, but at the same time, we do want to kind of, we love eating animals. So, and by just not exposing themselves to these kind of moral arguments, avoiding information, but then also willfully disregard this information, as we showed in our study with zoonotic disease risk, they're just disregarding and taking decisions that actually would address the problem at the cause, at the roots of it. So yeah, it's kind of a very disregard of the solutions that they're not necessarily not recognizing the problem, but they are against it because they can't live with the solution to the problem. So they want to, it's kind of that solution aversion. They don't want to have their habits to be implicated and kind of changed because of these problems.
I really like that. I really like that term. Oh, sorry. I was just saying, I really like that term, solution aversion. I've never heard that before, but it really struck me. Like and you said it was motivated skepticism about a problem because the solutions threaten your personal or ideological motives. And it reminds me of people who smoke, and you can pick up a packet of cigarettes with a picture of like blackened lungs on the packet saying, this is going to kill you. It's like, oh, well. And it's just it's almost there, isn't it? In that very action, that same kind of thing. So
those are the
No, so I think Roger had a question on meat committed persons.
No, it was the meat motivated mind that caught my eye, which was quite good. But in terms of what you've just said, Kristof, you did give some numbers in the paper. So you were talking about, this is US research from last year, that 50%, half of the people could see there was something to do with zoonotic diseases and our contact with other animals. But then it drops all the way down to 15 when it comes to, well, this is what you could do about it in terms of, so that's kind of what you're saying. And you were saying then that their strategy really was willful disregard of it, just to defend their practices, right?
Yeah, exactly. So just documenting that there's a knowledge gap, would just require a simple solution. That's like, let's educate people about it and then problem solved. But what we see, it's not that. Like, it's not just a knowledge gap. It's a bit, of course, animal markets, wild animal markets were more in the media, so people were more aware of that problem at that point. It's more salient. So, of course, they have more knowledge about it. But even just presenting them with the objective facts and identical information to them, like educating them, then then you can show that it's actually motivated disregard, motivated cognition kicking in, and still under recognizing the role of factor if I'm not wanting to know, because it would have implications for their own habits. So yeah.
It's the same as there's another element to this which I found really interesting. There was a lot of publicity in the end that wet markets were actually all over the world, but I imagine if you asked people, they would say they're in China. And I think this is the same process is going on. The fact that we had this kind of information, I mean, apparently there's loads and loads of them in London and England, but in terms of people's perception of it, you can guarantee they would say, oh yeah, that's what goes on in China, wouldn't you? And because again, this process is in play.
Yeah, well, and it was also like strongly kind of driven by Trump's idea of the China virus, and that I think there were other political dynamics going on there that were purely racist. So they want to kind of also picture China as kind of the bad country, right? And then it escalated towards violence and discrimination to Asian people in everywhere in the world. So there were like political strategies going on using the pandemic for other reasons as well. So as long as they can picture the other groups as the bad.
So it's quite a smart move for Trump, I suppose, to do that, I guess. But,
well, I have problems calling Trump smart, but
I know.
Yeah.
I was thinking, can I associate those two ideas myself?
Well, he's been very strategic about all these things, how to press the right buttons to kind of make things go bad, right? Like, or ways that's very, very self-serving and very kind of speak to his ideology of white supremacism and American dominance, right? So he's been doing that the entire time on different topics. So this time as well, the China virus, it became a whole different kind of thing once that new variant came in from the UK, right? All of a sudden, the ones in Scotland called it the London virus. So Boris would have a problem, but then in England and in London they called it, and some newspapers are still calling it the Kent variant, like just to make sure that it's not associated with the UK or with London. Like there's a whole dynamic going on there to not having an association with that virus, trying to ignore that it's collective responsibility to deal with these things.
We're so good at manipulating language, aren't we?
With your sorry, Roger.
No, carry on, Tom.
I was going to say, Kristof, with the paper that you did recently, the people that you surveyed, they were based in the UK, I believe, right?
Yes, yeah.
It'd be really interesting. I think you might have mentioned this in the limitation section, to see if those kind of conclusions that you've drawn from it are reflective in other cultures where people are, eat animals and things that come out of them. If that's a trend, or what were your thoughts on?
Yeah, my idea is that if you kind of have coming from that background, the norm is to go to the wild animal markets and eat meat from there, you would kind of be a lot more motivated to kind of engage in that as well, and then like to defend that practice as well, not wanting to see changes to that. The only thing that I can see what happens, what would speak against that hypothesis, would be that a lot of people who have been in touch with these animal markets also got the virus and it got really bad over there. So they might, because of that personal circumstance of like losing people because of COVID, that could be kind of an eye opener, like that things are not okay, and that might actually push people to change their behaviors or support or find alternatives to their dietary behaviors.
Okay, so
So basically, we've got our work cut out for us, really, haven't we?
Oh yeah,
By the sounds of it.
that's for sure. Going back to Rama, I did see. I think that she clarified it to be anti-speciesism. But perhaps what we could do, maybe if you reframe your question in the recording, Rama, then maybe we can deal with it then. And then for our final one, maybe we can just briefly deal with this this suggestion here. So what about interventions that target prejudice reduction with children? And it's interesting that children are already beginning to stereotype vegans. But I mean, it's interesting. A lot of other people would claim that almost like children are very kind of vegan orientated, or at least orientated towards other animals. But would you say there's anything here that we can do in relation to children? Because obviously, not
well, yeah,
it's
very hard.
Aren't they?
Yeah, that's the problem, that you cannot really kind of intervene with a lot of parenting practices, right? And then kids are being socialized into speciesist structures, and then a lot of like what Victoria Simpson said, like there's now evidence that's showing that children are a lot less speciesist or like than adults are, and they don't make that clear separation in terms of what is morally valuable. So they would value animals and humans a lot more equally than adults do. So when you grow up and your parents are serving you animals, you start to think differently about these topics, and then you become a lot more speciesist. And that's hard to intervene there because you don't have the freedom to kind of intervene there and put different values in space. I do think schools can play a major role there, or organizations or youth movements or sports club to kind of help valuing animals more than they do now. And one of the things is that like there's a lot of children literature that actually show pictures of animals in very positive ways, but sometimes also in very unrealistic anthropomorphizing ways that are so detached from reality that it doesn't have any real value for society, or like and then they grow up and come to learn that these stories are just stories, so it's not that we have to care about animals. So, but if you can change that framing a bit differently, and we can actually talk about animal emotions, capacities of animals, and caring about animals in ways that actually can connect to the real world, especially about farmed animals, then it might help to kind of educate children and change stereotypes about of like make them more resistant to speciesist parenting practices. But then again, it's very hard to do that without having parents on board.
Yes, indeed. So we're going to have to close this up, but we always seem to scratch the surface really in an hour and quarter of an hour really, but it's been fascinating. So thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Before we bring this to a close, two things. The one about the book, and unfortunately I cannot show the book because I have the electronic version. Oh, thank you very much.
Just by chance,
I'm enjoying the book right now. I haven't finished it yet, but one of the things I most liked about it is that it explores different topics relevant to the movement, and also that it is written for a broader audience. So in order to enjoy this book, you don't need to be an academic.
Thank you very much for those kind words. That was indeed what we tried to achieve.
It's the truth. It's the truth. And the other one is the conference.
Yeah. So
tell us about the conference.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
so at the end of June we have the Animal Advocacy Conference, Insights from the Social Sciences, where we bring together academics, scholars from different areas, including sociology and psychology, social psychology, and a few other domains as well, to present their people's research on animal advocacy strategies, but also fundamental research on how we perceive and deal with animals. And it's a very international conference, and it's going to happen all online, as we had to postpone it last year because of the pandemic. But yeah, it's very promising to see so many people now start working on these topics.
The conference is open to everyone, not only to academics.
Yeah, well, the initial kind of idea was also to have like a lot more involvement from animal activists, but now with the virtual conference, it becomes a bit harder to kind of really have a more vibrant dynamic there, and hopefully we can still have like good discussions and input from animal advocates and so. But yeah, animal activists can join, people from the public, non-academics can join the conference to learn and be intrigued by this fascinating research.
Deb is giving you the opportunity to wave your book around.
Again.
Why We Love and Exploit Animals: Bridging Insights from Academia and Advocacy. And there's a lot of psychology in there, a lot of authors in the book. So every chapter was written by a different team of authors, or from psychology and social psychology. But we also have people from critical animal studies. We have Carol Adams in there. And then we have also animal advocates in there, or people who have been in the movement for a very long time, including someone like Jean Bauer. And then sociologists like John Sorensen, who's from the critical animals perspective. So not all of them, especially not all the psychological scientists, would identify themselves as animal activists, or I never asked them whether they are vegan or not, but they do very interesting work on how people perceive animals and deal with these kind of topics. So yeah, it's a wide variety of topics covered there.
That should be your first question as an editor. Are you vegan? So look, we're 9 minutes away from Michelle. So out of courtesy, we ought to go, folks. So thanks a lot, everybody, for tuning in, and we shall see you next week. And
thank you, Kristof.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Very
It was
much.
really, hopefully it was interesting enough for everyone. And yeah, thanks to everyone for attending and for the super interesting questions.
very good. Okay.
Yeah, there've been some great questions. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.